The Zodiac's engine sputtered, coughed, and died. In the suffocating Red Sea darkness, the silence was louder than an alarm. 7 Mossad commandos and 32 Ethiopian refugees froze in the inflatable boat, adrift less than a kilometer from the hostile Sudanese coast. The commander, Donny Limor, didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every person in the boat understood the equation. A failed engine meant capture. Capture meant a Sudanese prison. For the agents, it meant torture and execution as Israeli spies. For the refugees, men, women, and children who had just walked 600 kilometers across desert and mountains to escape persecution, it meant being sent back to the hell they had just fled. Another agent, Gad, worked furiously on the outboard motor, his hands slick with salt water and grease. The tools were minimal. A single spark could give away their position. Far to the east, a pinpoint of light blinked in a coded sequence. It was their transport, the Israeli naval vessel INS Bat Galim, waiting in international waters. A clock was ticking. They had a window of exactly 28 minutes to clear Sudanese waters before the morning patrol routes began. That window was now closing. From the west, a new light appeared, sweeping across the water. A searchlight. A Sudanese patrol boat. It was moving slowly, methodically, tracing the coastline. Danny keyed his concealed radio. A single click held for 2 seconds. The signal for mission compromised, running silent. The light on the horizon blinked back, an acknowledgement. The Bat Galim would hold its position for as long as it could, but it couldn't risk entering Sudanese territory. The searchlight swept closer. Danny's hand rested on the grip of his pistol, holstered beneath his jacket. The rules of engagement were clear. Do not fire unless fired upon. A gunfight would expose the entire network, an operation years in the making, an asset so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, that it was hidden in plain sight. An entire village built on a lie. He could see the silhouettes of the refugees, their eyes wide in the gloom. They had faced bandits, starvation, and secret police to get here. This final mile was supposed to be the last step to freedom. Now, it was a trap. The patrol boat's engine grew louder. The searchlight beam danced on the waves, now just 50 meters away. Gad stopped working on the engine. There was nothing more he could do. He drew his own weapon. Every agent in the boat did the same, a series of silent, metallic clicks. The choice was simple and brutal. Fight and die, or surrender and disappear into a Sudanese dungeon. There was no third option. The searchlight washed over their position, and for a fraction of a second, every face in the boat was illuminated in stark white. The operation, and everyone in it, was exposed. The mission had failed. This catastrophe in the Red Sea was the culmination of a crisis that began thousands of kilometers away, rooted in centuries of history. To understand how Israeli commandos ended up in a dead Zodiac off the coast of Sudan, one must first understand the plight of the Beta Israel. For over 2 millennia, a community of Jews had lived in Ethiopia, preserving their faith in near total isolation. They dreamt of Jerusalem, a holy city they knew only from Scripture. By the late 1970s, that dream had become a desperate necessity. Ethiopia was ravaged by the Red Terror, a violent political campaign waged by the Marxist Derg regime under Mengistu Haile Mariam. Famine swept the land, and the Beta Israel faced intense persecution. They were a people on the brink of annihilation. Whispers of a possible escape route began to circulate. The only path was on foot, a brutal journey to neighboring Sudan. where it was rumored they could find passage to Israel. This was the genesis of a mass exodus. Entire villages packed what little they could carry and began walking. The journey was a death march. They crossed lawless territories controlled by warring militias and common bandits who robbed, brutalized, and killed them. They trekked through the merciless Gondar Mountains and the searing desert, where daytime temperatures soared and water was scarcer than mercy. An estimated 4,000 people, a quarter of those who attempted the journey, died along the way. Those who survived the trek did not find a promised land. They found the refugee camps of Sudan. Places like Gedaref were vast, sprawling cities of misery, rife with cholera, malnutrition, and despair. The Sudanese authorities were officially hostile. As a member of the Arab League, Sudan was an enemy state of Israel. Its secret police, the notorious NISS, actively hunted for Zionist spies, and any Ethiopian identified as a Jew faced arrest, torture, or worse. The refugees had to hide their identity, pretending to be ordinary famine victims while they waited for a miracle. In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, a man whose own family had been murdered in the Holocaust, felt a deep personal responsibility. He had received desperate, smuggled letters from the Beta Israel community. One simply read, "We are dying, help us." Begin's directive to the Mossad, Israel's national intelligence agency, was absolute. Bring me my Jews. The problem was a logistical nightmare. How do you secretly extract thousands of people from a hostile enemy nation, hundreds of kilometers from your own border? The mission required a new kind of operative. A team built not for assassination, but for large-scale deception and logistics under fire. The first key player was a man named Dani Limor. Limor was a veteran Mossad commander, known for his unconventional thinking and his unnerving calm under pressure. His past operations were the stuff of agency legend, including missions deep inside other hostile Arab nations. His unique skill was improvisation, the ability to tear up a meticulously crafted plan in a split second and devise a new one on the spot. He was chosen to lead whatever plan they could conceive. His direct subordinate was Gad Shimron, a Vienna-born agent who had joined the Mossad after a career in the Special Forces. Shimron was the opposite of the cerebral Limor. He was a man of action, a field operative who specialized in on-the-ground problem-solving. If a truck broke down, a contact failed to show, or a bribe needed to be paid, God was the man who would handle it. He provided the practical muscle to Limor's strategic brain. But the most unconventional player was a woman named Yola Reitman. Reitman was not a commando. She was a former El Al flight attendant who had been recruited for her poise, language skills, and her ability to blend in. Her job was to operate in plain sight, to scout locations and make contacts in environments where a male military type would stick out. Her skill was social engineering, the art of appearing so harmless and ordinary that no one would ever suspect her true purpose. The final, and arguably most critical piece of the puzzle, was not a Mossad agent at all. He was Ferede Aklum, an Ethiopian Jewish teacher who had himself fled the persecution. After reaching Israel, he was racked with guilt for those he left behind. He volunteered to go back into Sudan at immense personal risk, to act as the Mossad's man on the inside. His mission was to locate the scattered Jewish refugees within the camps, organize them into covert groups, and prepare them for extraction. He was the bridge between the high-tech Israeli operation and the desperate, terrified people on the ground. Without Ferede, the entire mission was impossible. He was the ghost moving through the camps, whispering the promise of Jerusalem. The geopolitical chessboard was treacherous. Sudan was led by President Ghaffar Nimeri, an autocrat walking a political tightrope. On one hand, he postured as a staunch Arab nationalist, hosting figures like Yasser Arafat and publicly condemning Israel. His security services were virulently anti-Zionist. On the other hand, Sudan was bankrupt. The country was crippled by civil war, famine, and foreign debt. Nimeri was pragmatic and deeply corrupt. He understood that his survival depended on a steady flow of foreign cash, particularly American dollars. This created a small, secret crack in Sudan's hostile facade. While publicly an enemy, Nimeri's government might be willing to look the other way for the right price. This was the fragile hope the Mossad clung to. Early attempts at rescue had been small-scale and fraught with risk. Mossad agents had tried smuggling small groups across the border, but it was too slow and too dangerous. They had experimented with light aircraft landings in the desert, but the risk of detection was enormous and the capacity was minimal. They needed a highway, not a footpath. The mission's genesis came during a brainstorming session at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. An analyst projected a map of Sudan onto the wall. Limor, frustrated with the failing land-based options, pointed to the long, desolate Red Sea coastline south of Port Sudan. "What about here?" he asked. "What if we take them out by sea?" The idea was radical. It would require a forward operating base inside Sudan itself, a place where they could stage refugees before moving them to the water. But how could they establish a base in an enemy country without being discovered? The answer came from Yola Reitman. Posing as a representative for a European travel company, she spent weeks scouting the Sudanese coast. She drove a rental car down dusty, forgotten roads, mapping out potential sites. Then she found it. Just south of Port Sudan lay the Araus Holiday Village, a collection of bungalows on a stunning coral reef. It had been built by Italian entrepreneurs in the early 1970s, but had been abandoned for years due to a lack of running water and electricity. It was a ghost resort, decaying in the African sun. To the Sudanese government, it was a failed investment. To Yola and the Mossad, it was the perfect cover. The location was ideal. Remote enough to avoid scrutiny, but close enough to a major city for logistics. Most importantly, it was right on the beach. The plan that formed was one of the most audacious in the history of espionage. The Mossad would create a fake company, a Swiss-based tourism firm. They would lease the Araus resort from the Sudanese government, claiming they wanted to turn it into a premier diving destination. The agents would pose as the hotel staff, managers, diving instructors, windsurfing guides, and under the cover of running a legitimate holiday business for real European tourists, they would conduct their secret war, smuggling thousands of refugees out of the country right under the noses of the Sudanese military. The execution of the plan began with a masterclass in deception. Mossad's logistics department created an entire corporate identity from scratch. They registered a front company in Switzerland, complete with a physical office in Geneva, a bank account, and professionally designed letterheads. They printed glossy, full-color brochures advertising the Araus Holiday Village, the diving and desert recreation center of Sudan. The brochures featured stunning photos of the Red Sea reefs and promised an unforgettable holiday experience. They were mailed to hundreds of travel agencies across Europe. Armed with this elaborate fiction, a team of agents, led by a man posing as the company's director, flew to Khartoum to negotiate the lease. The meetings with the Sudanese Ministry of Tourism were surreal. The agents, in their business suits, presented their flawless business plan, complete with financial projections and marketing strategies. The Sudanese officials, eager for any sign of foreign investment, were thrilled. A price was negotiated, a 3-year lease for $320,000. The cash, delivered in a suitcase, sealed the deal. The Arouse resort was now officially operated by the Mossad. The first team of agents arrived in Port Sudan not as commandos, but as hotel managers. Their first task was not espionage, but renovation. The resort was a wreck. They had to get the generators working, install a water purification system, and furnish the bungalows. They hired a local staff of 15, cooks, waiters, drivers, and cleaners. None of them had any idea who their new European bosses really were. Soon, the first guests arrived. Real, paying tourists from Germany, France, and Italy, who had seen the brochures and booked a diving holiday. The agents had to play their parts perfectly. By day, they were cheerful hosts. Gad Shimron, the hardened field operative, found himself teaching German executives how to windsurf. Other commandos, trained in counter-terrorism and sabotage, were leading guided dives, pointing out coral and clownfish. The daily routine was a tightrope walk. Mornings were for serving breakfast and planning tourist activities. Afternoons were for maintaining the equipment and managing the staff. But when the sun went down and the last tourist had gone to bed, the real work began. Under the cover of darkness, the resort transformed from a holiday village into a covert operations base. A truck, driven by another agent, would make the perilous 800-kilometer round trip to the Gedaref region. There, they would meet with Faridi Aklum's contacts. A group of refugees, usually between 30 and 100 people, would be waiting in a hidden location. They were crammed into the back of the truck, under a false floor or hidden among cargo, and driven back towards the coast in absolute silence. The journey was fraught with danger. Military checkpoints dotted the highway, manned by bored, corrupt, and unpredictable soldiers. The agents had a carefully prepared story and a wallet full of bribe money, but every stop was a spin of the roulette wheel. A suspicious guard, a crying child, a flat tire. Any of it could bring disaster. Once the truck reached a secluded rendezvous point a few kilometers from the resort, the refugees would disembark and walk the final stretch to the beach. There, hidden in a grove of palm trees, other agents would be waiting with the Zodiacs. The refugees would be loaded onto the inflatable boats and ferried out to the INS Bat Galim, the mothership, waiting silently in the blackness of international waters. The entire operation, from the truck leaving the resort to the Zodiacs returning, had to be completed before dawn, before the local fishermen set out, before the first tourist woke up wanting coffee. Then, the agents would return to the resort, hide the equipment, shower off the salt water, and start their day shift, smiling and asking their guests if they had slept well. They did this week after week, living a bizarre double life. One night, they were smuggling human cargo past military patrols. The next morning, they were making omelets for a honeymooning couple from Paris. The operation was a symphony of low-tech solutions and high-tech tools, all pushed to their absolute limits. The core of their communication network was a pair of advanced, encrypted burst transmission radios. These devices could send and receive complex messages in a compressed burst lasting less than a second, making them nearly impossible to intercept or trace. The main antenna was disguised as a flagpole on the resort's roof. A secondary, more powerful antenna was hidden inside one of the resort's large rooftop water tanks. Power was a constant source of anxiety. The resort ran on diesel generators, which were noisy and unreliable. A generator failure during a radio transmission could be catastrophic. The team had a backup system of car batteries, constantly being charged and maintained, a hidden lifeline to their command in Tel Aviv. The transport vehicles were a study in calculated anonymity. They were standard beat-up Toyota and Isuzu trucks, purchased second-hand in the Port Sudan market. They were deliberately kept in a state of slight disrepair to blend in with the thousands of other dilapidated vehicles on Sudan's roads. The agents became expert mechanics out of necessity, learning to fix everything from fuel pumps to broken axles on the side of a dark road, using only flashlights and hand tools. The most critical piece of transport technology was the fleet of military-grade Zodiacs. These were not recreational boats. They were designed for Special Forces insertions, with reinforced hulls and specially muffled twin outboard engines. Their advantage was their low profile. Fully inflated, they sat low in the water and were difficult to spot, especially at night. Their weakness was their engines, which were high performance but notoriously temperamental, prone to flooding and overheating. Every extraction was a gamble on the engines holding out. Navigation at sea was a tense fusion of old and new. The agents used commercial-grade GPS devices, a novelty at the time, to plot the precise rendezvous point with the Bat Galim. But they couldn't rely on them completely, as the signals could be erratic. They cross-referenced the GPS with old-fashioned celestial navigation and dead reckoning, using the stars and a compass to guide them through the darkness. The most dangerous technological limitation was the complete lack of night vision equipment for the Zodiac teams. The technology existed, but it was too bulky and too sensitive to risk bringing into Sudan. The agents operated in near total blackness, navigating by starlight and the faint glow of the ship's shielded lights, their eyes straining to spot patrol boats or submerged reefs. A miscalculation of a few degrees could send them crashing into coral or straying into a shipping lane. This technological tightrope walk defined the operation's character. Advanced communications hidden within a crumbling infrastructure, powerful engines that could fail at any moment, and modern commandos navigating by the same stars their ancestors had used for millennia. The plan, for all its brilliance, was fragile. The real world constantly threatened to tear it apart. The first major setback came during a routine refugee convoy. The truck, carrying 40 men, women, and children, was stopped at a new, unscheduled military checkpoint just outside Port Sudan. This checkpoint wasn't on their maps. The soldiers were not the usual bored conscripts. They were from a different unit, alert and suspicious. The lead agent, posing as the driver, went through the usual script. He was a European working at the Arouse resort, transporting goods. He offered the customary bribe. The commanding officer took the money, but wasn't satisfied. He ordered his men to search the truck. In the back, crammed together in the suffocating heat, the refugees held their breath. A single sound would betray them. An agent sitting in the passenger seat, a veteran of numerous close calls, knew that arguing would only increase suspicion. He calmly got out of the truck, lit a cigarette, and engaged the officer in a conversation about the terrible quality of local fuel, complaining about how it was ruining his truck's engine. He opened the hood, pointing out fictitious problems, creating a technical diversion. He drew the officer's attention away from the cargo bed just long enough. The search was cursory. The soldiers gave the tarp a half-hearted poke and, satisfied by their officer's distraction, waved the truck through. It had been 30 seconds of pure terror. The incident forced an immediate change in tactics. All routes were re-evaluated. The bribery network had to be expanded to include this new unit, a costly and risky process. The second complication came from the resort's own success. The fake brochures had worked too well. The aroused village was becoming genuinely popular. One week, a group of particularly enthusiastic Belgian divers arrived. They were so enchanted with the reef that they wanted to do a night dive, something the agents had never anticipated. The Belgians' request coincided with the arrival of a refugee convoy at the nearby rendezvous point. The extraction was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. Panic flickered through the team. They couldn't have tourists swimming around the very spot where they were launching military-grade watercraft. Danny Leemore, the station chief, made a quick decision. He instructed another agent to stage a diversion. The agent, who was serving the tourists' dinner, feigned a sudden, violent case of food poisoning. He collapsed on the floor, groaning dramatically. As the tourists and local staff rushed to help him, another agent secretly ran to the generator's shed and cut the main power line to the bungalows. The resort was plunged into darkness and chaos. Amid the confusion of a faked medical emergency and a power outage, the extraction team slipped out unnoticed, launched the Zodiacs, and successfully ferried the refugees to the mother ship. The sick agent made a miraculous recovery an hour later, blaming a bad piece of fish. The most dangerous escalation came not from a random event, but from the enemy. The NISS, Sudan's Internal Security Service, began picking up on faint signals of unusual activity. Rumors of trucks moving at night and strange goings-on at the European resort reached a senior officer in Port Sudan named Colonel Abdel Rahman. He was a shrewd, ambitious man, and he smelled a story. The colonel decided to pay the Arouse resort an unofficial visit. He arrived unannounced one afternoon, dressed in civilian clothes, pretending to be interested in booking a holiday for his family. He was greeted by Danny Leemore himself, playing the part of the affable Swiss hotel manager. The two men sat on the veranda, drinking lemonade, engaged in a battle of wits. The colonel asked probing questions about the resort's finances, its clientele, the nationalities of its staff. Donnie answered every question with a calm, plausible lie, all the while knowing that a single slip of the tongue could mean his death. The colonel became a regular visitor. He seemed to enjoy the company of the Europeans and the free drinks. The agents realized he was trying to lull them into a false sense of security. They had no choice but to play along. One agent was assigned the terrifying task of befriending the colonel. He took the intelligence officer diving, taught his son how to swim, and spent long evenings listening to the colonel's complaints about his job, all the while feeding him a steady stream of disinformation. The agent reported that the colonel was getting closer to the truth, that he suspected something far more significant than a simple tourism business was at play. The operation was now hanging by the thread of a forced friendship between a Mossad commando and the NISS officer hunting him. The sea extractions, once the core of the mission, were becoming too risky. The colonel's scrutiny meant any mistake would be fatal. Worse, the flow of refugees from Ethiopia had become a flood. The sea route was saving dozens, but thousands were now waiting and dying in the camps. The mission had reached a breaking point. It had to escalate or it would collapse. The decision was made in Tel Aviv. The sea route was no longer sufficient. It was too slow, too small, and with the NISS closing in, too dangerous. They needed a bigger pipeline. The new plan was codenamed Operation Moses, and it was a quantum leap in audacity. The goal was to airlift the refugees directly out of Khartoum, the enemy's capital city. This was no longer just a Mossad operation. It required high-level geopolitical leverage. Secret diplomatic channels were opened. The United States was brought in. The CIA, which had its own assets and influence within Nimeri's regime, began to apply quiet pressure. A substantial, untraceable payment, tens of millions of dollars, was offered directly to President Nimeri in exchange for his passive cooperation. The deal was struck in the shadows. Nimeri would allow a series of clandestine flights out of his country, and in return, he would get the money he needed to prop up his failing government. He would deny everything, of course. The logistics were staggering. The Mossad, working with the CIA, secretly chartered a fleet of Boeing 707s from a Belgian charter airline called Trans-European Airways, TEA. The airline's owners were brought into the secret, but the pilots and crews were kept in the dark. They were told they were flying famine victims from Sudan to refugee camps in Europe. The final piece was getting the refugees from the camps near the Ethiopian border to Khartoum, a journey of over 500 kilometers through hostile territory, without alerting the authorities. The same network of trucks that had served the sea-based operation was now repurposed and expanded for this new, more dangerous phase. The climax came on the night of November 21st, 1984. This was the night of the first flight. At 21 hours, a convoy of 3 unmarked trucks carrying 250 Ethiopian Jews arrived at a disused warehouse on the outskirts of Khartoum. They had been driven for 10 hours, hidden in cramped, lightless compartments. They were exhausted, terrified, but silent. At 22:30, under the supervision of Mossad and CIA agents on the ground, the refugees were moved in small groups to a remote, poorly lit section of Khartoum International Airport, far from the main passenger terminal. CIA assets had bribed the airport's chief of security to ensure his guards were stationed elsewhere. At 23 Swalk, the TEAI Boeing 707 landed. As it taxied to the designated hardstand, the flight crew could see only a few ground crew and a bus. They had no idea that just beyond the range of the lights, hundreds of people were hiding in the shadows. The boarding process began at 23:15. In complete darkness, the refugees were led from their hiding places to the aircraft's rear stairs. They had been instructed not to speak, not to make a sound. One by one, they filed into the dark cabin. A young mother struggled with her baby, who began to cry. Instantly, she pressed the child's face into her shoulder, muffling the sound. The silence was absolute, a collective act of will. By 23:45, everyone was aboard. The doors were sealed. But the plane didn't move. An unexpected problem had arisen. A mid-level Sudanese security official, one who hadn't been included in the main payoff, had appeared on the tarmac. He refused to grant the flight clearance for takeoff without an additional personal customs fee. A CIA case officer, carrying a briefcase full of cash, engaged in a whispered, frantic negotiation next to the plane's landing gear. For 20 agonizing minutes, the entire operation hung on the greed of a single official. Finally, at 00:05, a bundle of cash was exchanged. The official shrugged and walked away. The plane was cleared. At 00:20, the Boeing 707's engines spooled to a roar. It thundered down the runway and lifted off into the Sudanese night. Inside, there was no celebration, just the quiet, collective exhale of 250 people. As the plane climbed and banked east, clearing Sudanese airspace, the Israeli agent accompanying the flight took the cabin intercom. He spoke first in Hebrew, then in Amharic. "Brukim habaim," he said. "Welcome home." For the first time in hours, a sound filled the cabin. It was not shouting. It was the sound of weeping and the soft murmur of ancient prayers. Operation Moses became a machine. For 6 weeks, a flight left Khartoum for Tel Aviv every few days. The process was refined, the bribes standardized, the logistics smoothed out. Nearly 8,000 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to freedom. The Arouse resort, its primary purpose now superseded by the airlift, was kept open with a skeleton crew as a backup and a diversion. The operation was a stunning success, but it was a secret that couldn't be kept. Against a strict government gag order, a low-level official at the Jewish agency in Israel, seeking to claim credit for his organization, leaked the story to an Israeli newspaper. On January 3, 1985, the world learned of the secret exodus. The international fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Exposed in front of the entire Arab world, a furious and deeply embarrassed President Nimeri instantly halted the flights. He publicly denied all involvement, blaming foreign spies and ordering a crackdown. The airlift was over. The Mossad team at the Arouse resort received an urgent coded message: evacuate immediately. Their cover was blown. They calmly informed their last handful of tourists and the local staff that the resort was closing for the season for renovations. They packed their hidden equipment, destroyed any sensitive documents, and that night slipped out of the country, leaving the Arouse village empty once more. The story, however, was not over. Nimeri's public denial was a death sentence for the thousands of Jews left behind. Nearly 1,000 were stranded mid-journey, hiding in Khartoum. Thousands more were still in the death camps of Gedaref, their identities now known, their lives in imminent danger. This is where the final, hidden layer of the operation was revealed. The true genius of the Arouse resort was not just that it was a cover for one operation, but that it was a platform for many. The world believed the Mossad had been caught by surprise when the story leaked. But this was only partially true. While Operation Moses was indeed compromised, the agents had never fully abandoned their original sea-based plan. Even as the massive airlift from Khartoum was underway, a small core team had remained at Arouse, continuing to run small, high-risk extractions by Zodiac. This was the contingency, the secret plan B that the press knew nothing about. These final, desperate extractions saved several hundred more people, even as the main airlift was being shut down. But there were still hundreds stranded in Khartoum itself. The mission's final chapter was written not by the Mossad, but by the United States. In a secret initiative personally championed by then Vice President George H.W. Bush, a new rescue was planned: Operation Joshua. It was a purely military solution. On March 22, 1985, U.S. Air Force C-130 Hercules transport planes took off from a base in Europe. They flew a circuitous route, avoiding detection, and flew directly into Sudan under the cover of darkness. They did not land at the international airport, but on a makeshift desert airstrip that had been hastily prepared by CIA assets. In a single, breathtaking night operation lasting just a few hours, the C-130s landed, loaded the remaining 500 refugees who had been trucked from Khartoum, and took off, flying directly to a military base in Israel. It was a swift, brutal, and effective end to the Sudan chapter. The legacy of these interconnected operations is staggering. Over the course of 3 years, from the first Zodiac extraction to the final C-130 airlift, more than 14,000 Ethiopian Jews were rescued. It was a modern exodus, an act of national will conducted through subterfuge and spies. The Arouse Holiday Village, the fake diving resort that served as the heart of the operation, was never reopened. It fell back into ruin, its bungalows slowly succumbing to the sun and sand. Today, it is a dilapidated, forgotten relic on the Sudanese coast. The local people tell stories of the strange, rich Europeans who came and went so suddenly, but few know the truth. The resort stands as a silent, crumbling monument to one of the most improbable and successful humanitarian operations in the history of espionage. A mission where commandos became hotel managers, where tourists became unwitting cover, and where a luxury vacation brochure became a passport to freedom.